Hafadeits and Mananasitsu'us, everyone, Todu Samsu. Thank you all for being here today. The Guam Trademark Commission will now be called to order. For the record, in accordance with the open government law, meeting notices were given to all commission senatorial members, stakeholders, and all the main media broadcasting outlets. The first notice was given on Thursday, September 12th, 2019. The second notice was given on Tuesday, September 17th, 2019. Today is Thursday, September 19th, 2019, and the time is 8:38. We have, I always need to start remembering to count before we get to this point, because it's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so we have 10 people present, which represents a quorum. 9 of them are members. Thank you for attending this morning's meeting. So, recapping last month's meeting, we continued our discussions towards identifying intangible arts and developing definitions for the various art forms. That, as we've mentioned before, is ongoing work. And we also had Attorney Stacy Salas from the Office of the Attorney General. She provided a presentation and informative as well as interactive overview on the Guam Trademark Commission Act. Today, Attorney Salas will again provide a presentation discussing 2 other laws involving trademarks and intellectual property rights. These discussions are useful as it provides informed and meaningful direction for the Commission to move forward in creating the framework and the scope necessary in drafting the Guam Cultural Trademark Act and the Guam Trademark and Intellectual Property Rights Act. So, let's go around. We've had the call to order, but if we can go around and just have everybody state their name so that we can get that for the record, everybody who's present. And then we'll move on to item 2A on the agenda. So starting to my left, we'll start with Senator Pito. Senator, if you can...
Once again, my name is Senator Taitano Trelai, in charge of public safety all over within this government. Thank you very much. And also, I guess I am the vice chair for my good senator here, Senator Taitano. And thank you very much.
Mananasitsu'us, Guausi Anne Marie Arceo, Presidente ni Departamento ng Kalugunan sa Moro. Jesus maasi.
Hafaday Mananasitsu'us si Laura Sauderzo.
Good morning, my name is Francis Guerrero. I'm with the CAHA Board.
Rita Nauta, Guampedia.
Good morning, Matthew Baza, the Guam Economic Development Authority.
Albert Paris, the Department of Revenue and Taxation.
Good morning, Guahusi Stacy. I'm from the Office of Attorney General.
Good morning, my name is Chris Lizama. I'm representing Pilar Lujan from the Guam Visitors Bureau.
So again, I want to really thank everybody. I know everybody has really busy schedules every week of the year and every month of the year. So the fact that you are coming together and being part of this commission so faithfully, I really appreciate the time that you're putting towards this. So let's move on to agenda item 2A, new business. I want to inform the Commission of recent communications concerning Guam's ability to participate in the United Nations Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, or otherwise known as ICH. So that program has a lot of potential. It's one that we've talked about a little bit before. It involves domains of oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals and festivities, knowledge of nature and the universe, and traditional craftsmanship, amongst others. So in this, I've been communicating with Ms. Akatsuki, who represents the intangible cultural heritage work, amongst other work for UNESCO in the Pacific. And so she had referred me to a colleague in Paris, and although I didn't get to have direct correspondence with the fellow in Paris, she was able to get information back from him herself, and she passed it on to me. So what she pointed out via the colleague in Paris is that the U.S. has not ratified the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, and so thereby U.S. and Guam are not eligible to some of the ICH work, especially the funding aspect of it. But she did also point out, and this is where I think it's really important for us, our community as a whole, is she said that NGOs or non-governmental agencies that are engaged in intangible cultural heritage activities, even in Guam, may be accredited by UNESCO if they meet certain criteria put forward by UNESCO. So if they are a legal personality, if they've had 4 years of existence, for example, there is an NGO she provided in Hawaii called the Pacific Tradition Society that will most likely earn that status this year. So even though they're in the United States, even though the United States has not signed on to the convention, as an NGO, a non-governmental agency, they can still participate in the intangible cultural heritage programs and perhaps be available for certain funding. So I think that's very good news for us. We have some very active NGOs here, and I think we as a commission or we as individual members can perhaps help spread that information and reach out to some of those NGOs and see if one or more of them is interested in this kind of work. And at some point, it'll be easy to find on your own, but perhaps at our next meeting, we can look a little bit at the types of things actually on the intangible cultural heritage listing. They have a variety of traditions, recipes, even traditional political government that's not in written form. There are all sorts of things there that are very precious to the people of Guam, especially Chamorros, that they may really want to consider getting on that listing to be safeguarded. And she also noted that the application form is available online. So we'll continue to follow that a bit as we do our work and see if we can encourage some of the NGOs on Guam, at least one of them, to be actively doing some of that work. Yes. Okay. And then item 2B of the agenda. So today we have Attorney Stacy Salas from the Office of the Attorney General, who will provide an overview of Guam's patents, trademarks, and copyrights. Title 5 GCA, Chapter 20, Article 4, and Trademark Counterfeiting Act, Title 9 in the Guam Code Annotated, Chapter 47. So we do have various things in our books, but what the work that we're doing will build on those and then take them much farther. The Office of the Attorney General is a member of the Guam Trademark Commission on this set of commissioners. And today's presentation is continuance of the Office of the Attorney General's guidance in providing a more meaningful understanding of the local and federal laws applicable to developing the Guam Trademark and Intellectual Property Rights Act and the Guam Cultural Trademark Act. And copies of her PowerPoint presentation and corresponding laws are provided for you for your reference, and then we put a note section there. Even for myself, I'm going to be writing notes as we move along. So, Attorney Stacey Salas, Sejus Maasi for putting in that work again, and we look forward to your presentation.
No problem, guys. I hope everybody had their coffee again. And there are 2 sets of laws that I'm supposed to cover today, but realistically, I'm pretty sure we're probably going to only cover this law, which is the Patents, Trademarks, and Copyrights law that we have in the books currently. So we'll go ahead and start with the PowerPoint presentation. So that's the cover, and then we'll move to the next slide. Again, the legal disclaimer, this is not actual legal advice. It doesn't create an attorney-client relationship between the AG's office and individual, entity, corporation, and everything that's on that slide. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide. And when I was researching this law to try to give it some color for you guys, for everybody, some of the legislative history included a letter from the Director of Commerce at the time, and there was a list of different letters or concerns that were considered, that were listed in this letter. I sort of just copied some of it and put it there, but one of the main stories, I think, was the impetus for creating this law was Mr. Joe Chargloff, who was at the time the president, and at the time I mean around 1995, president of Designers Local, Inc. According to Mr. Chargloff, a representative from Kmart came into his store, took a look around, and when Kmart opened, he saw the mass production of what he believed to be very similar or exact replicas of his work on T-shirts. So, I think with respect to where or why we have this law, it's important to be, or to know some of the color behind it, what gives this law life, or why we gave it life. And so, last time, for my previous presentation, I went to Kmart. And this time, I thought it was interesting that the timing was such that this time I went to Chamorro Village. So, in keeping with the spirit of the Commission's goals and the Guam Cultural Trademark and the Chamorro Cultural Arts, I wanted to start off with another activity to see if you guys are awake, and if not, give you some time to wake up. So we won't break up into teams. Basically, you can just, on a piece of paper, number from 1 through 7. And I don't have any criteria, so we're not going to determine, is this an authentic Chamorro piece? Is this made by a Chamorro artist? Because that's sort of the role of you guys. But I wanted to see if you guys could tell, just at its very basic, your basic sense of well, it's not basic, but I guess just the most simplest sense of whether you can tell if something was made on Guam. Okay? So there are 7 items, and I'm going to pass them around, and you can just number them 1 through 7. I have cookies for everyone, so nobody's a loser, everybody's a winner. And we'll start off with number 1, and it's a mixture of local items, and that's not a legal term. Don't quote me on that. Okay, so I'm going to pass Mr. Perez number 1. And I'm going to give Chris number 2, and we'll just, mix it up. And whatever number you get, just go ahead and write whether you think it's made on Guam. That's it. Okay. Here's number 2. 3. Yes. You're all gonna get to see 1 through 7. Just go ahead and indicate for yourself whether you think it was made on Guam. 4, 5, 6. So basically, next to the numbers, you want to write yes or no. Yes, if it's made on Guam. No, if you think it's made elsewhere. Yes. Good question. There are numbers on these items. I think we're almost done, but I'm just going to pass these cookies around because, again, everybody's a winner here. Yes, they're made in Guam. Help yourself. All right, everybody, please help yourself to cookies, and I will give you the answers. So the first item Yes, it's made in Guam. Number 2, no, it's not made in Guam. Number 3, no, it's not made in Guam. Number 4, yes, it's made in Guam. 5, yes. 6, yes. And 7, no. So this is number 1, the little replica of the kumzu, made in Guam. Yeah. And then number 2, we have this necklace, and it's not. It's not. Yeah. Number 3 is this bracelet here. No, it's not. Number 4, the earrings. Yes. Phoebe at Chamorro Village made these. Okay. And then number 5, yep. Number 6, yes. I'm sure you guys know who the maker of this is. And then number 7, no.
I have a question. When you went to purchase it, right? For example, the kumzu, number 1. How did you know that it is made on Guam? Did you ask the question and they told you, or?
That's a good question. Yes, I did. I asked. Yeah. Okay. And I didn't want to get into the murky waters of like the identity of the maker, but I can say they were Chamorro, identified as Chamorro, the person that made the kumzu.
Okay.
So, but that's for you guys to determine, right, what the criteria would be for an item like this. Yeah.
I thank you for that exercise, and I did pretty well. I did get a couple wrong, and that's partly because I've seen Sanahi or Sanahi-like items made elsewhere, and so I hadn't been sure about the Sanahi item. And the other aspect of it is we have very talented artists who are constantly evolving. But I think your exercise really illustrates very well that it's very difficult, even for those of us, I know several of us, if not most of us here, really go to the different crafts fairs. We go to Chamorro Village, we seek out the local artisans. And even us, we had a little bit of difficulty, or at least I did, on a couple of items. I wasn't quite sure because others start copying so quickly what we're doing. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting to bring up the idea of copying and what is actually substantially similar, or whatever standards you guys come up with, because some of us Indigenous folks see something and we want to connect with it. So then the copying part gets murky because then we start to police identity. And anyway, capitalism, right? Okay. Okay, so we can move back to the slideshow presentation. And so that's Mr. Chargliff's story, probably related to him somehow. Next slide, please. The legislative findings at the time were that there's a growing number of Guam residents that are actually designing and manufacturing products on Guam, and the legislature wanted to provide a level of protection because the process to protect it federally was cumbersome for local folks, local businesses. And so then we'll move on to the next slide. I found a letter from the Committee on Ways and Means, and I bring this up because it would be good to include in the laws that you guys proposed, possibly some of the concerns, and it deals with the financial aspect of a law like this that you guys are thinking of creating or proposing. And the recommendation here is to assess the cost to enforce. And that's the point of this part, and this is a concern even in 95. And we can move to the next slide. So there's another recommendation to insert language to clarify US registered trademarks. versus the Guam trademark. Consider compensation for victims of infringement, so that's probably a cause of action, maybe in civil court, possibly. Inclusion of sanctions for continued violations, and that's something to consider. You know, it's not like do this, create a cause of action, but it's something to consider because, you know, there are real lives impacted by these laws and money. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. So part of what has occurred in the creation of the law is the funding aspect. I think that this slide, and I highlighted the number there, but that's probably a typo. It's rather than 13 million, it's probably 13,000 if you look at it. And I just wanted to give you guys a flavor for how much money was sort of put into it in '95. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. So under the law, right, 5 GCA 204-01C, the legislature defined trade name. So it's a word or name used by a person to identify the business, the vocation, the occupation, and distinguish it from others. And so examples are Magmata tribe, Sagwa Manyagu, and Fauna cultures. These are trade names. So when you see these names, you'll understand sort of what the product is or the business that they conduct is. And we can move to the next slide. Trademarks are a word, name, symbol, or device, or a combination adopted to identify goods and distinguish them from others. So these are symbols that, is anyone unfamiliar with these symbols? Probably the third one, the one in blue, is probably the newest one on the scene. But so we'll start with the cello symbol. Everybody knows that that's their trademark. And then we have Fokai in the middle. And then that's All-Nesian Division is the blue symbol. All-Nesian Division, Nesian. So those are just examples I'm including. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So the trademark law is supposed to protect things such as prints, which are defined in the law. So a print is any original artwork, design, poster, lithograph, or literary work. And all I did was include examples of artwork that trademark law may seek to protect. And then below you have the artist name. So I have the @ symbol for Joshua Barragata, Frank Perez, and Chris Perez Howard. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So how does this law work on the ground? If you've already registered with the U.S. Patent, Copyright, and Trademark Office, then you would, under the law, go to the Director of Commerce. But as we all know, the Director of Commerce is now GITA. And so that would be the Director of GITA. But on the ground, like the way it works, I was just talking to Mr. Perez about this. This process occurs actually at Rev and Tax. So you'll see in the law that it says Director of Commerce. And so that's something to consider. You would take your application to register your U.S. protection at Rev and Tax, and you'd pay a $50 fee. And that's supposed to go into the general fund. Okay, next slide. What it does is create, at this point on the ground, I think the effect is to create a record of your trademark and what it is that you're trying to protect. You don't have to do it with the US. It's optional. Yeah, so that would be the next to just file here. So, sorry.
In this regard, when you're talking about if you already are registered in the U.S., you go locally, pay an additional $50 to go into the general fund, and does that mean that the Guam laws will help enforce what we have? Because you know, after a certain period of time, you still have to go back to the U.S. to continue your registration, and so is this like always like a part of the cycle?
So the first part of it is the funding piece for enforcement, and that's the hope. But the law as it is, I think it's like the reason for the commission today is for you guys to sort of iron out these issues and I guess clarify maybe the issues with the current law.
So if I understand it correctly, you can go through the process through the U.S., and that is all-encompassing, as opposed to Guam. Am I correct? The registration in Guam only is valid here? Or does that cover even our Chamorros in the States that are producing things as well?
Okay, so to make sure that we're confirmed on what I'm saying, the first item is that I am not doing an analysis on the federal law. We're going to create a law school after this for a trademark, Chamorro trademark. But the goal here is just to show you what we have on the ground for Guam. So with respect to what federal law protects, I can't answer because I don't know. And do you have protections in Guam? Under this law, you're supposed to. So, and I'll get to the slide with respect to what we have. And if you guys feel like there isn't something there that you want there, I would recommend writing it down because that's important. That's critical for us moving forward. And then if I didn't answer part of your question, just let me know.
Well, I'd just like to add, I think this is all really important discussion. It shows all that murkiness that does exist. And so something we'll want to keep in mind, and we'll be continuing to seek your guidance, is if we develop something here, what are the boundaries on how far that extends? Does it, as Mr. Guerrero was saying, can we only legislate and it only extends to our borders, which is my suspicion. But then also I think it becomes additionally tricky because we have online presence. And so if people are in the States and people from Guam are visiting that site, that may be beyond what we can legislate, but we'll certainly be seeking the guidance of the Attorney General and other legal advice as to how we might, well, at least how we're going to handle it and what the parameters of that are going to be.
The other question I had, and I think we need to distinguish this in all of our deliberations, is when you passed around the 7 items, I was thinking, okay, is this made by a Chamorro, or is this made on Guam, or is this made outside of Guam? And so you had made it clear that we were looking to see whether it was made on Guam or not, right? Which is the product seal, right? But it could have been, there were several items that could have been made by, I mean, all of the items could have been made by anybody on Guam, right? So we need to keep in mind the focus when we think of a Chamorro trademark, right? Because it's not the made on Guam trademark as it is reflective of Chamorro artisans. So again, that would also impact Chamorros abroad.
I think we'll have the ability to do both. One is for the broader community, and then one very specifically towards Chamorro cultural traditions and arts.
And I appreciate that comment because when I was trying to determine what I was going to ask you guys, that's the criteria that you're going to come up with. If you're asking yourself, was this made by a Chamorro, that's probably one of the criterias, maybe. So I didn't want to get into that, but I wasn't trying to do a made on Guam, like with the product seal. I was just like, probably the most simplest, I don't know, maybe to ground these objects was it made on Guam? But that's a very good point because I'm not trying to talk about the Guam product seal. I just, whatever was going through your mind when you're looking at it and whether or not it's an item you would purchase if you were looking for authentic items, like I would write that down because that's where the criteria comes from, authenticating it.
And the thing is, there's a distinction, for example, an artisan can make a kamzu, right? a traditional kamzu on Guam, which is a useful tool. Anybody can make a replica of a kamzu, which is a substantially different kind of product. So we also have to think in terms of those variations, right? So a sinahi made as a representative of one of the pulans, you know, which is a traditional knowledge-based artifact, right, is substantially different than making replicas
I think
as
also,
jewelry, you know?
Yes, exactly. I think that the categories for what items are, whether it's jewelry or a decorative piece, because there are vendors at Chamorro Village that sell, for example, ornaments for whatever purpose you may use an ornament for. So, yeah, distinguishing the categories of
Right.
artwork.
Body adornment versus accessory,
Yeah.
jewelry.
Or a magnet is like a house decoration or something, I don't know, a kitchen
Yeah.
decoration. And then the question of jurisdiction is not directly dealt with in this law, directly. So you won't see anything about jurisdiction in this law, but in the rev and tax forms, it'll say on Guam, you know, the jurisdiction is on Guam. So, but that's a form, that's not a law. But that's why we're here. Because the goal is to try to, you know, move the dial forward to something more clear for everyone. All right, we'll move to the next slide. Okay, so you can, oh, sorry, could we go back one? So the Guam certificate, you can get, you can originate your registration here. So you would file with the Department of Commerce, but again, as I mentioned on the ground, you go to Rev and Tax. You describe the goods or the manufactured articles that you're going to use your label, your trademark or trade name for. So to be more clear about this, it's you present to them your trademark or your trade name, and you have to tell Rev and Tax what are the products you sell under those trademark trade names. You have to declare that you're the sole or original proprietor, or assign an authorized proprietor or user. And the fee for this application is $100. And in the previous meeting, we received a packet. You guys have copies of these forms. So we can move forward to the next slide. So the Guam law offers 5 years of protection. It's renewable. You can authorize different users. And the Department of Commerce is supposed to issue regulations. So we'll move to the next slide. Okay, so folks that file a false application, there are remedies under this law that provide that if you knowingly file a false application, you can be fined up to $30,000. And if you do so without intent, so without knowing, up to $3,000. So I'm laughing because 30,000 and 3,000, I'm not quite sure how we came up with that number, but it's good because we're trying. All right, next slide. Unlawful use is defined as using an identical or similar print, label, trademark, service mark, or trade name. So if you use an identical or similar print label, then that's considered unlawful use. And also I wanted to point out that there's another standard in here, and it's in 20409. It's also unlawful if you use something that's confusingly similar. So I don't know if you have access to the statute 20409, but I'd highlight that because confusingly similar is a standard that may, for, you know, I don't know, lack of a better term, cause more confusion, you know? So think about that term, because if anybody could walk in and say, it's confusingly similar, then, you know what I mean. Okay.
Remember the exercise we did last time? Those symbols were confusingly similar, But it is very confusing wording in the first place, yeah, so that would be difficult. Do you know if there are any existent certificates filed with Reventax?
Yeah, there are.
There
Well, okay, I can't tell you for sure, but just in talking with Mr. Perez, there have been applications filed with the specimens, and so presumably people have their certificates because a lot of businesses do both federal and Guam. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. All right. So remedies for unlawful use, you can get an injunction, so ask somebody to stop doing what they're doing, and then there's another 20401. Oh no, 20410, sorry. There's a $10,000 fine also that can be imposed. So that's for unlawful use. The previous fine was unlawfully filing an application that you know is false. Two separate things. All right, so we'll move to the next slide. So your certificate can be revoked if you don't use it for 365 consecutive days, or you're not registered in the name of the registrant under the U.S. office. So that's specific to if you file your U.S. patent here, or I guess it's supposed to protect folks who are already filed in the U.S. office, or for folks that file false applications, basically. Yeah, if you don't use it, you will get revoked for non-use. How that actually works on the ground, I don't know. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So the process for revocation, the director can do this on their own. If they notice that it's not being used, or a person can file a verified petition saying that the person who registered the trademark is not the true person that has rights to that trademark. The registrant, who's a person that you're accusing shouldn't be registered, has the opportunity for a full hearing. They should receive notice of the claim, and the director grants or denies the petition. That should be one word, director. Okay, next slide. And then it can be appealed, whatever the director's decision is in the Superior Court of Guam. I just spoke to Mr. Perez, and he hasn't heard of any claims that have been filed. That's not to say that none have been filed, but it just gives you some on-the-ground information. All right? Under the law, the director is the Director of Commerce, and so that's a good question, because the Director of Commerce is GITA. You know, the Director of GITA. Because at some point, the Director of Commerce or the Department of Commerce was abolished, but a lot of the duties or the activities of that agency was just reenacted through GITA. Well, I don't know.
I know there was an executive order back in like 2002 or something, when the Department of Commerce was disbanded, that sort of moved things around. As to where the trademark was put, it may have been delineated in that executive order. I don't have a copy. I think I have a copy at the office. So we would need to find out where exactly things were put. You might want to look up any executive order that may have been done at that time. I'm not sure. All I know is that back then they got rid of the Department of Commerce, and they moved things around. And I think it went to a bunch of different agencies. I think like Department of Labor got something, BSP got something, Reventax got something. So as to where things go, I don't know. But I think there's an EO somewhere that talks about that.
Awesome.
And So that gets me to, well, partly, a question that I had. You know, when we were talking about the Guam certificate and the regulations that may or may not be developed, since some of this is happening at the Department of Revenue and Taxation, do we know, are the regulations there? Are there regulations there about the Guam certificate? Do you know, Mr. Perez?
Well, I believe just the information that you need when you do file for a registration, and then I believe they're done on a case-by-case basis. With respect to the enforcement, I think this public law has to be revisited and to clearly delineate the responsibilities of the revenue tax as well as Guam Economic Development Authority, because it may make sense to delineate those responsibilities, because the perception is from the public and those engaged in trade and commerce is that GITA is really the go-to with respect to these kinds of infringements. But nonetheless, we are the repository of these applications, and we'll certainly be able to assist other agencies.
So I think one of the things that I'll put on the agenda as homework for myself, and others can chime in if they want to assist, but finding that executive order so that we can each get a copy of it and really understand it, and understand where some of those responsibilities about the Guam certificates and some of what we've been going over, whether they are with GITA, how much of it is perhaps with the Department of Rev and Tax, and if it exists anywhere else, and then to see if we can find some of the rules and regulations, if they exist somewhere, so that we can get an understanding of them, and then they can inform us as to whether they're something useful to build on for the work that we're doing, or whether they indeed need to be revisited or built up themselves.
Okay, that's great. I think I agree with everybody. It looks like we may be able to get to the next slideshow. If folks are good to go, I can move forward with it. It's a little bit more of a depressing scenario here. No cookies, no games. So if we can do the next slideshow, I'm sorry guys, I know I said we probably won't get to it. So counterfeiting. How many of you have gone to the Philippines and seen Louis Vuitton bags sold for $10 or maybe even $1? I don't know. What? This is a law that we're trying to, prevent counterfeiting on Guam with. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Legal disclaimer, same as before. We'll move on to the next slide. So a registered mark, as defined under our law, is a trademark or trade name registered in the U.S. and the United States or it should be United States Trademark Office, or in any state, commonwealth, or territory of the U.S., or registered in Guam. So there are examples of registered marks. The McDonald's one and the Starbucks symbols are pretty universal. And did you get one, Chris? Okay. All right, next slide, please. I have some examples of counterfeit marks. I'm sure everybody has seen the Nike and Samsung marks. And these are examples of counterfeit ones. So we'll go ahead and move forward to the next slide. So if you intentionally and knowingly reproduce a mark, it's a crime on Guam. And there are different levels of crimes. So it's a misdemeanor if your sales are less than $500. And then if your sales go above or at 501 and between at 501 and between 1,499, then you're at a third-degree felony. And then it's a second-degree felony if you're making over $1,500. Okay, so we'll move to the next slide. It is a law. All right, so we're moving to trafficking. So we're moving.
Sorry, just want to make a comment then for the commission. I think what we need to consider is I have seen already in the market a lot of counterfeiting going on. I've even seen it affect some of our local cultural producers that aren't too familiar with trademarking process to begin with, and they're the ones who get hurt the most. I think it's interesting how they've set up that penalty benchmark. Maybe something we need to reconsider. To me, greatest counterfeiting happens with really big industries that produce to where the volume of business that comes out can be in the millions. And here our current law just goes up to maximum of 1,500. I mean, just something to think about.
Sorry, just to clarify, if we can go back to that slide, it's like a floor. It's a minimum. If you get a second-degree felony, it's that you sold counterfeited goods at you made at least $1,500 or more. So if you make 1501, you'll still be at fault. All right. Okay. So we'll move on. The next slide. Trafficking. So if you intentionally or knowingly transport, you're moving these goods, or you obtain control of them. So you have them in your garage with the intent to transport them or move them further or dispose of them, then that's trafficking. And we'll move to the next slide. Again, the classification of charges, they're the same, if not very similar.
Are you talking, when you talk about trafficking, are you talking about companies selling counterfeit product here on Guam? Like
Let's go back to the slide.
At the flea market, at the, Chamorro Village?
Okay. Well, let's go back one more. Sorry. Thank you. Okay. If you transport it, so if they're moving it, if they transfer it or dispose of it, or you sell it, in consideration for anything of value. So if you sell it for money, then that's trafficking. I'm kidding. Okay, we can go back to the PowerPoint. We're just going over the law, guys. Okay, next one. One more. Again, thank you. Okay, so defenses. There are some protections for folks, if, and it's a sort of mirrored off of the federal law, but abandonment of the counterfeit items, permission, if you get permission from the authorized or the owner, or equitable estoppel. So like you've seen it happening and you didn't do anything about it. Generally, that's what it means. I don't know if that's what, the court hasn't ruled on what it would require for equitable estoppel. I'm just speaking generally. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So some of the remedies here are prosecution of folks who are breaking the law, and then within the prosecution process, destruction of the counterfeit items, that's an option. Restitution, of course, for the folks who were harmed through the copying or the counterfeiting. And then there's a protection for landlords, so people that are leasing property or places where these activities may be happening, but the exception, you're not protected as a landlord if you have actual knowledge of the counterfeiting or the counterfeit mark, and you're a principal or an accessory. You can't be a participating landlord. So I think that's it for the slide show. If we can move to the next one, that's it. Woo, we made it. All right. Oh, sorry.
Sejus Maasi, Stacy, for a very engaging set of presentations as always. We are now on item 3, open discussion. Did people have any further questions or something that they also wanted us to be looking at as we go forward?
Are we responsible for the counterfeiting, for reviewing and recommending changes to the Counterfeiting Act as well?
No, not under the law that we have, not under the commission's duties.
But obviously it's related, right? But this is a whole different ballgame and requires a lot of enforcement.
That may be something, as you're saying, it's related, that as we build up the actual Intellectual Property Act and Trademark Act, that we may then want to revisit the counterfeiting and some of the enforcement parts. I think we've heard from Gita before that enforcement is one of the more difficult aspects, but there are ways it can be tackled by having really good communication with the store owners, letting them know that they're liable for things that are being sold in their store if they're not ensuring certain things. But I think that's a really good point. I think we as a body may want to revisit some of that counterfeiting law, just to make sure that it's now going to do some of what we need it to do with what we're developing.
I know in Puerto Rico, in Old San Juan, they tried to, really strengthen the enforcement piece, because so many vendors, like street vendors, were selling product under the guise of being local producers, right? They were selling knockoffs, from China, the Philippines, and so on. And the artisans were not getting the business that it was intended for them to get, right? As soon as they began controlling what could be sold and really enforcing the law related to counterfeiting, local artisans were able to sell much more effectively. So it does have a relationship, a monetary relationship. It's just a matter of being willing to take on the counterfeited products, which can be very unpopular. So
Sejus Maasi, for bringing those issues up. It's very important because what we're doing here is we're really trying to create protection. And it's not about being punitive, it's about protection is our guidance, protecting our local community, protecting our local artisans and others who might be manufacturing materials. So really, like I said, that's our guidance, is protection. And you're absolutely correct. I had spent some time going through parts of Europe and Northern Africa, and it was incredibly hard to find something there that wasn't made in China. And so really wanting to try to get something from local artisans, a lot of the people there were saying that their local artisans couldn't compete with some of the lower prices from entities like China. And so they had moved on to other things, and their local artisan industries had really dwindled. So you're really doing a good job of connecting those dots. And we're here to try to help our local entrepreneurs and our local artisans and others be able to thrive while they're here. So thank you for connecting those for us.
Just like to share that in my experience dealing with local cultural producers in the GUMA program that I'm a part of, a lot, what we're seeing is there are several that are not clear, I guess, on where Guam trademark stops and where U.S. trademark takes over, and vice versa. And I think that's something that as we develop or work through and change the existing laws here in Guam, we need to be conscious of that, so that we can actually be able to tell our local cultural producers that there is an advantage to filing in Guam, even if you filed with the U.S., and vice versa. Because I do know filing with the U.S. is a very extensive, tedious, and long process, and neither is it cheap. So for some people, they may perceive, if our law is strong enough, that it's enough of an advantage to file in Guam without going that far, as long as they know that they're protected elsewhere. Yeah.
Again, very excellent points. And with what you're bringing up, if I could look towards Stacy, so not now, not on the spot, but if that's something that you could be as part of your continuing work that you do after we break, if you could be continuing to look at issues like that so that as we're moving forward month by month, we can be getting clearer and clearer understandings of exactly where our boundaries are going to be. And I think already you're highlighting that if we make it a strong but more straightforward process than the one in the United States, which is perhaps also dealing with a much larger group of people registering, that people will see an advantage to registering here. If nothing else, it's going to be more straightforward, and it's going to be a shorter, less expensive, although there may be some give and take as far as how much protection we can give and the boundaries we can provide.
Senator Kelly, I also want to mention that when we gave our presentation at the Mariana's History Conference, we did I don't know if all of you are aware, we did a panel. Senator Kelly and Gita, Matt, and I were able to share a little bit of what we were doing and get a lot of good feedback and questions, which will be valuable as we continue the process. But it's clear that we really do need to understand that our relationship with this trademark issue is twofold. I mean, there's a Guam trademark issue, right? And then there's a Chamorro trademark issue. One of the things I learned in speaking with one of the presenters who's based in New Zealand is that the Maori trademark process that we kind of benchmarked, the difficulty that they've been having is related to who determines validity or authenticity, and then who issues it. And one of the things that they have strongly considered is the fact that if you give the responsibility to artisans, that it's an overbearing responsibility, and it fractured the process in New Zealand with the Maoris. So it's important for us to consider that it is a government function and needs to be much more formalized than giving it to to an NGO or a nonprofit group to handle.
Thank you for Sejus Masi for bringing that forward, and for people, members who are continuing to have these conversations to understand the issues involved, because it's just as important, if not even more important, to understand the challenges that these other areas like New Zealand are coming across, and hopefully we can learn from some of those challenges that they're having. And I think it's in that regard, we had talked before about trying to develop something that has a bit of flexibility, a bit of fluidity. I think you're mentioning that it be a government function, that's very important, because it can be, I can see what you're saying, that it can be very difficult if artisans are policing each other. That can become very contentious, very difficult. Because it's already a challenging area when you're talking about something as organic and fluid as art and intellectual property. But I think part of what will be really helpful to us also is that distinction you made earlier between a replica and a cultural item. And we may even consider like a third category, although I don't know that we'll need to. But I know that when pieces are being sold or purchased by museums, that they're expecting it to be of a certain degree of authenticity and caliber. So we might even have a third element to that, or we might decide that that's the responsibility of the museums in talking with the cultural groups themselves, rather than trying to tie down the artisans too much. That might be maybe too overbearing and too much interference from the government side of things.
But I think you have a point in that, for example, those who craft sakman or proa or galaidi or one of the traditional navigating, vehicles, right? They undergo the navigators, the navigators that are re-emerging, right, are learning the craft from the traditional seaworthy sense of the word, right? From masters. So if you want a replica of a proa, I'm sure that anybody can kind of copy, what was produced, but the replicas that exist in the Guam Museum, for example, are authentic replicas. Scale, material, craft, tooling, all of that went into the making of those replicas, which is very different if you're using modern technology. That's a different kind of product. So again, you're right. I think we may need a third category for a high-level authentication for museums and for displays like that.
And again, bringing up that point, you mentioned that role of masters, and that may be one of the ways. Now, it's blending some of those lines with governmental and artisans, but that might be part of that flexible process, at least for the high-level museum sorts of pieces, that just like we see with granting entities, that there needs to be an advisory board and it needs to be a recognized X, Y, or Z that's guiding the project. Maybe for that high level of piece, it could be that there just has to be evidence of having a master involved, because if a master is involved, it's kind of like having a Ph.D. in seafaring or a Ph.D. in whatever their tradition is. And so it's having that assurance within the cultural realm itself. So that might be something that we can do, that it's not too restrictive, but it still pays attention to those traditional forms of authentication, because there have always been masters that are recognized within the community.
Senator Kelly, one of the things I don't want to forget, somebody mentioned this during the conference, was how do you distinguish between, is handmade authentic versus machine-made? And of course, our sort of off-the-cuff response would be, it has to be handcrafted because that's how traditional craft is done. But who are we to say that it can't be machine-made? And so those are some fine-line distinctions that I think we need to address.
I agree, and I don't think we have to be restrictive, because I don't think you're talking about being restrictive. But even when I was teaching the Fatina Silati class, where we were trying to recapture the tradition of Lati carving, and we worked a bit both with traditional and modern tools. So some of it was by using hammer stones from volcanic rock, some of it was using a brick hammer. And so I think that could be something that perhaps there could be different levels. And just so if it's handcrafted, that allows that artisan to be able to charge even more, because the time, the skill, the tradition that's involved, that can be, if it can be recognized, as we saw with those items that Stacy passed out, each of them means something to us. The Kamsu means something to us. The Sanahi means something to us, and things like that. But we also want to be able to provide an opportunity to recognize those that are crafting by hand, because it is much more intensive. It is perhaps more skillful in certain ways. Not to say that machine-made items or making a latte with a brick hammer doesn't still involve skill. But so we might consider that just having different levels or different trademarks that mean different things. Not that we want to also make that too complicated. I think we can all remember when, was it Homeland Security was putting out those different levels of danger, and it was like white, ecru, beige, orange, and it became very difficult to deal with. So maybe if we come up with a major 3 or major 4 types of categories, maybe that won't be too much.
So just a thought to add to that. For a lot of the local cultural producers that are doing things that become what we call hard goods in a retail industry, there aren't the factories out here that can produce those. Hence, they go to China and Philippines and other places to produce. Maybe the solve to that, because they are truly local and they've designed them here, then the trademark could be given for the design itself. And so the artisan still gets some credit for it, despite the fact that it's not made here.
And I think that's something that could fall into that replica category. And that segues in to my proposal is for the next meeting, for us to, if those that were part of that Mariana's History Conference panel, if they would be willing, I think it was very successful, if each of us would be willing to share that here. So this way, the larger community of Guam gets to hear it, but everybody provided something. I provided a few visuals. I think I was inspired by Stacy to provide some visuals, because I think it really helps people understand. Maybe for a lot of people in the larger community, they aren't seeing how globalization and the way that commercialism is moving, how we may be having a whole lot of replication of cultural and local items coming up in our very near future. And so I had provided a lot of visuals about things that had happened in Samoa, things that had happened elsewhere, and actually at least a couple of incidences, 2 or 3 or 4 incidences that have happened with Chamorro cultural items as well. So I can provide that. And then Matt would provide maybe about 20 minutes. We'll expand the time. Matt will provide about 20 minutes of an overview about the Guam trademark, the Guam product seal. And that really will further strengthen us understanding what's in place so that we're creating something that's distinct and building upon what's in place. And then Dr. Souter did a really excellent overview of some of what's mentioned in the bill, where it was the American Indian Handicrafts Act and some things like that. And so I was very, very appreciative that she had done some of those overviews of other acts, because it won't make sense for us to create something from scratch and reinvent the wheel. It's important for us to look at what's been working for other places, as well as you brought up earlier, what some of the challenges are. And so with that, there's also, if I can ask the Department of Revenue and Tax, I don't think it would be a very lengthy presentation on your part, but maybe you could look at some of the ways that the Department of Revenue and Tax is carrying out their responsibilities. Perhaps you could be part of us looking for those rules and regulations. And you're familiar with what Stacy has presented as far as your forms in the process, but if you find any additional elements that you think will be helpful for us to understand about what's actually occurring now. Yeah, and so I think that'll give us a very full agenda for next time. And then if we can continue to think about what those working groups would be, because I think after that, we'll be ready to really roll up our sleeves and start diving into some work about all that we've been hearing about and talking about amongst ourselves. The discussion will be to the very end about all of these murky and challenging areas. But I think after that next meeting, after that, we can start tackling some of the work in our subcommittees. Are there any further questions or comments that people have? So now that we have no further items for discussion, can I hear a motion to adjourn? Sujus Maasi, Mr. Guerrero, and do I hear a second? Seconded by Dr. Souter. All those in favor? Motion carries to adjourn this Guam Trademark Commission meeting. The time is, well, and I'll say my thank you first because sometimes they cut me off when right after I say the time, which is good. They're doing the job that they're supposed to do. But I want to say again, Sujus Maasi, for everyone here, you've all participated, you've all been very engaged, you've all given up a good amount of your time for the good of the community, so Sujus Maasi for all of that. Okay, now I'll get back to the time. So the time is 10:55. Have a good day.